Folks are still coming in and we're running a little bit late, so I'm going to start my introduction and hopefully people can find a seat. So I'm Eileen Hershenov. I'm the Senior Vice President for Democracy Initiatives at ADL. I want to welcome all of you here, and I know we have registered, this is a very good sized crowd, and we have many times that I know who are watching us online. This session is being live streamed. I also wanted to note that questions and answers will be collected via index cards. We're going to have to go a little bit shorter to make up time. We will get some questions, but we'll be going a little shorter than we had originally planned. So you couldn't ask for more important timeliness of this panel, which is on elections and political violence, extremism, and disinformation. And of course, we've just come through the midterm elections, which at least thus far, were not as bad as we thought, as many of us feared might happen in terms of both extremists getting into office, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, or political violence. But as the panelists will say, we cannot rest just yet. Let me briefly introduce, and I'm going to have to work off my notes here because I have such incredibly credentialed panelists, so forgive me while I read. To my left is Professor Robert Pape of the Political Science Department at the University of Chicago, and Bob is the director of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats. He has studied political violence for over 30 years and has published widely on the limits of coercive air power, the utility of economic sanctions, the causes of terrorism, and most recently, escalating American political violence. In fact, since January 2021, Bob has led research teams conducting numerous studies of the Capitol Hill insurrectionists, as well as a series of nationally representative surveys of insurrectionist sentiments in the US population. Most recently, just a month plus ago in September of this year, Bob's consulted extensively for the United States government and other governments, and he's been published not only prolifically in academic journals, but in mainstream media. And if you've watched CNN and a host of other broadcasts and cable TV, you will have seen him there as well. His work has been credited as being path-breaking in his areas of focus, and he's really set the terms of debate. His work is also extraordinarily important for our planning at ADL in how to fight extremism and online hate and disinformation. All the way to the left, I'm not going in order here, I have Yolanda Savage-Narva, the Assistant Vice President of Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for the Union for Reform Judaism and the Religious Action Center. She's also an alumna of Juvie Nation cohort, a past vice chair of the Commission on Social Action, Senior Shusterman Fellow, a member of the Board of Directors for the Federation of Greater Washington, the Capitol Jewish Museum, Leading Edge, and Historic Six, and I Synagogue in Washington, D.C. Yolanda is also a member of Delta Sigma Theta sorority, an international Black sorority dedicated to community service and education. She is a graduate of Tougaloo College with a degree in sociology and has a master's degree in education from Jackson State University. And then finally, in the middle, my colleague, Oren Siegel, who is Vice President of the ADL Center on Extremism. He and his colleagues combat extremism, terrorism, and all forms of hate, both in the real world and online. Recognized as the foremost authority on extremism, the center provides resources, expertise, and training, which enable law enforcement, public officials, and internet and technology companies to identify and counter emerging threats. Oren joined ADL in 1998 after working for the New York Times and the Jewish Community Federation in San Francisco. Much of his 21 years with ADL has been devoted to evaluating the activity and tactics of extremist groups and movements from across the ideological spectrum, training law enforcement officers, and publishing reports and articles on a wide range of extremist targets. In 2006, Oren was recognized by the FBI for his exceptional service in the public interest. He was named to the Forward's list of 50 influential, intriguing, and inspiring American Jews in 2019. What happened the last 3 years, Oren? And he is a graduate of Wheaton College in Massachusetts. I'm going to go right to introductory remarks, only saying by introduction that in the last few years, experts in and out of government, in and out of academia, have warned that the threat to democracy and the risk of political violence is more significant now in this country than it has been in decades, and in many ways since 1860. So I'll ask each of you, starting with Bob, then we'll go Oren, then Yolanda for some introductory remarks. What's the nature of the risk we face? Bob first. How did we get here, and what's next?
Thank you very much. This is a precarious moment for our democracy. There's no more important group for us to be talking to than the ADL at this precarious moment. For many decades, the ADL has been the organization in the United States leading the fight against extremism. That extremism has now moved from the fringe, it's still in the fringe, that's the militia groups, etc., to the mainstream, where there are now millions of Americans who support violence rather than accept losses in elections and other political issues. I've been doing that work, as Eileen said, for the last 2 years. I used to work on international terrorism. As Oren knows, we've been on those panels many times before. I'm now focusing on the threat in the United States because this is the biggest threat to the United States. It's not coming from a foreign actor. It is coming from those millions of Americans in the mainstream. The election that we just had, it could have been far worse. In many ways, it was a great day for democracy, but it was a day for democracy. There are now, as a result of the election, more insurrectionists, I call them, politicians sympathetic to January 6th. There are more in office than before. The New York Times this morning counts in the House 15, they call them election deniers, 15 new election deniers have been added to the House. So this is not a day where the House became more peaceful. We don't yet know about the Senate, but what's happening in our country is that those many millions that I'll talk about in more detail in the next round, those many millions are justifying violence, normalizing violence, and they are, unfortunately, helping to install their support, the folks they want to lead the country, who unfortunately are way too open to violence. And that's something that the ADL can do something about. It is very much the case that there's large majorities in both the Democratic Party and, yes, the Republican Party who oppose violence. Right now, those are being polarized, chopped up. The ADL is a bipartisan organization. The ADL can help build a bipartisan coalition against violence in a way I don't know there's another organization in the United States that can. So I'm here today to talk to you about some of those details, to tell you there's a path forward, and I hope to energize the ADL to take on this mission, because have no doubt, it would have to be taken on. This isn't just going to happen with the normal way the ADL does its business. And that's a problem, because that means change. I think it's important for the country. I think it's important for the ADL. And as you'll hear, Anti-Semitism is just lurking beneath the surface of this thing that's called the Great Replacement, which I'll talk more about in another round. Thank you.
Test. Okay, great. Hi, everybody. So just a couple comments off the top. One is when I joined ADL 304 years ago, I was thinking about, I want to combat anti-Semitism. I want to fight back against various types of extremists. I didn't know when I first started doing this that the work that we would be doing at ADL would also be a fight for the soul of our democracy. And so oftentimes I find myself now being asked to speak on panels such as this and others where a lot of the discussion is about our politics and our democracy. And I'm like, I'm an extremism expert. I mean, and yet, as Bob mentioned, these two things are so intertwined today. And I think that says a lot about the landscape of both extremism in this country and the landscape of our democracy, that those two conversations are happening at the same time. So I have one number I want to throw out there, right? Numbers sometimes are more effective than words, but 13.4 million. Anybody know what that is a reference to?
I might, but I'll keep my...
I know, but you're on here. So 13.4 million people yesterday, and the day before, voted for extremists in this country. And I'm not talking about the election deniers, right, of which many more people voted for. I'm talking about people who either support or endorse or identify as QAnon, who support, endorse, or identify as Oath Keepers, who are facing seditious conspiracy charges for January 6th, Proud Boys, etc. 13.4 million people felt that that was going to represent them. I think that says a lot, again, about the nexus between our democracy and extremism. And one sort of last point. We know that extremists are, by design, trying to get into this space. So when you think of extremist activity at school boards, extremist activity targeting medical professionals, extremists targeting election officials, they essentially want to say not only that they want to undermine our democracy, create fear and anxiety, but they want to create a space where people are afraid to take on public service. It'll be too dangerous for them to do so. And to me, nothing undermines democracy more than the fear of serving your community. And the extremists are doing this by design. I know this because the incredibly talented team at ADL and the Center on Extremism is monitoring how extremists are planning their activities before midterms, before presidential elections, but that this is their everyday focus in a way that, frankly, we just hadn't seen before. So again, when we think about our democracy and elections, I will tell you that the Center on Extremism staff, right, that is focused on trying to understand and mitigate and expose extremists have to be part of that conversation because that's where we've gone as a country. And I look forward to digging into more of the how and why with this great panel moving forward.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Eileen, for such a warm introduction. Thank you, ADL, for hosting this very important panel. And thanks to all of you for being here, for making time for this, both those in the audience and those who are watching the live stream. So the 13.4 million just takes my breath away when I think about that. And after the past 48 hours, there is some optimism around the number of people, the sheer number of people who came out to vote, to make their voices heard, and we just have to do more of that. In 2019, I was asked to write something about what I thought the impact of the 2020 elections would be on me personally. And so I thought about that for my opening remarks, and interestingly enough, it's not too far off from where we are today. And so if you give me a moment, I'll read it to you. And it says, Toni Morrison once wrote, "We die. That may be the meaning of life. But we do language, and that may be the measure of our lives. Language is so very powerful. I am very careful about the language I use because I understand the impact of words and how profoundly life-changing they can be. As a Black woman, Jewish, mother, daughter, wife, friend, words have either uplifted and inspired me or discouraged and hurt me. And both sets of words can have a tremendous impact on a person's self-worth and self-esteem over time. Words can determine whether or not you feel supported to go the extra mile or stop just shy of the finish line. Words can give beautiful life to a dream or kill it, because words plant seeds. And entities such as social media, television, and even email germinate those seeds, fertilize them, and send misinformation and disinformation all over the world to millions. And we have witnessed, all too alarmingly in recent years, how words have been used to divide and demean and incite violence against groups of people. So in 2019, if you would ask me, do you think that this world could turn to the violence that we've seen? I would say it's possible, but in 2022, I know that it's possible. And what are we going to do about it? What's next for us? We can't wish it away. We can't hope that it will just disintegrate, and go into thin air. We have to do something about it. We have to vote. We have to stand up. We have to be strong, and we have to make our voices heard. And we did that 48 hours ago. Let's continue to do that.
Thank you so much. Well, we're here at Never Is Now, the biggest annual summit on anti-Semitism and hate in the world. And it's for that reason that my next question is going to go right to anti-Semitism. And I really, when I go around and I talk about democracy and I talk what are the greatest threats, the sentence anti-Semitism is the greatest or one of the greatest threats to democracy in the United States today is not in my repertoire. I do speak about it. I speak about how it's foundational and core to white nationalism. I talk about some of the things we're seeing. But lately, I've realized that I've got to get a better grasp on what, if any, is the relationship more deeply between anti-Semitism and the corrosion of democracy in this country. So let me turn right to whoever wants to take this first. And what role does anti-Semitism play in the escalating political violence we're seeing and that you as experts believe we're going to continue to see today in the United States? Bob, you want to start off?
Yes, I think that this question is maybe the most important of the questions to talk about at this conference, because there's no doubt that the ADL is concerned about anti-Semitism. It's all over the website, all over the work that's being done here. I don't think it's been clear how that relates to the insurrectionist threat that I'm talking about. So I want to try to clarify that. So in the surveys that we've done, and you go to the CPOST website, the University of Chicago, you will see that our most recent survey done in September found 13 million people, the equivalent of 13 million in the United States, who agree that the use of force is justified to restore Donald Trump to the presidency, even if some are injured or killed. That's a tough question. We weren't expecting to get anything like those numbers, because think how specific that question is. Now, underneath that, what are the beliefs driving those 13 million who are these adamant insurrectionists? Number one is the Great Replacement. QAnon is there, but number one is the Great Replacement fear. They fear that the Democratic Party is deliberately changing the white electorate and replacing that white electorate with minorities from the third world in particular. That's the connection with immigration. That's their number one fear, the Great Replacement. Now, let's go to the anti-Semitism. Many of you will have heard of the Great Replacement. I started talking about this in the news about a year and a half ago, and then Tucker Carlson just said, yes, that's true, what Pape say, and he embraced it, and then he's run with it. But let's develop this a little bit more, which is, so I know quite a bit about the Great Replacement theory. Many of you probably have not read Camus, the French guy, so you may not know the full depth of the thinking. That Great Replacement idea is an idea of two parts. One is there's a white population being replaced by a non-white population, but there are elites who are evil in this theory, who are liberal in this theory, who are often Jewish in this theory, who are doing the replacement. They're the replacers in the theory. If you go to the Buffalo shooter who killed those 10 African Americans in Buffalo in May, all over his 180-page manifesto is the Great Replacement, and you know what the next target was after the African American? Jews. You will see the connections if you read the 180-page manifesto. The attacker on Pelosi has anti-Semitism going side by side with this whole idea that it's important to use force for, targeting people that Trump hates, basically. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to point out that this isn't just another conspiracy theory where they're all kind of floating around. Unfortunately, in many of the heads of the folks, these things are tied together. And so anti-Semitism is really a part and parcel of much of the Great Replacement. It's not only Jews in their theory is liberals who are often Jews, or the money behind the liberals, if you see what I mean. And that's really important to understand. So at Charlottesville, when you hear the phrase by the neo-Nazi group, the Jews will not replace us, what are they thinking? Are they literally thinking that 2% of the population is about to become 60% of the American population? No, it's about the Jewish leaders, influencers, or protocols of the elders of Zion that many of you know a lot better than I do. So I think that's very important for ADL to clarify.
So just to build on that a little bit, there are many conspiracies out there that we know animate people to action, and some to violent action. The Great Replacement theory, is sort of the prime example of that in recent years. The shootings in Pittsburgh and Poway, in Buffalo, as you mentioned, but also in Christchurch and in Halle, Germany. And this is a global conspiracy that points to the Jewish community, but it's on the fringes in many ways, but there's a version of it that's adjacent to it that may not be explicitly about the Jewish community, but then when we hear it on Fox News, it resonates with people who are looking for that sort of connection to the Jewish community. So Great Replacement theory, like many of the extremism issues that we're talking about, is no longer this sort of fringe issue, but we are seeing it and hearing it from the mouths of our politicians, from our broadcast news. And that normalization of conspiracy is fundamentally geared at undermining democracy, right? So the more that people are fearful and have anxiety, the more that they distrust the tyrannical government, right, the more that you're going to see people take action. And so we see this with conspiracy theories even about the election, right? Election denial is now sort of a term that is used. I will tell you that election denial on its face doesn't necessarily have like a Jewish character to it, right? It's not like an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. But we see where that conspiracy of denial of elections is playing out on various spaces online that hopefully some of you will never be on. I think you have been on it. But others, this is where these things are normalized before they get to sort of the public discussion. And election denial is adjacent to the Great Replacement theory, to a whole set of other anti-Semitic conspiracies. So my point is, at the place where conspiracies are incubated, before they sort of jump and migrate to our public discussion, they're actually being marinated in anti-Semitism. And frankly, tell me a conspiracy theory about government or about industry or anything else that, when you scratch the surface, doesn't eventually lead to some sort of anti-Semitism, right? And that's why I think combating, most importantly, anti-Semitism, explaining why this is false, where it's coming from, how did it become part of the mainstream, etc., is a way to protect our democracy, to explain and have people understand. Therefore, combating anti-Semitism is fighting for democracy. And we just have to recognize that as a fact. And by the way, fighting against all forms of hate as well.
Great explanations. I'll just add a couple of points about anti-Semitism, and that anti-Semitism seeds are germinated everywhere. Everywhere you look, everywhere you turn. And so those seeds allow people who have the agenda to make democracy what it used to be, not this new democracy that really looks at everyone through the eyes of B'Tselem Elohim in the image of God, and through the eyes of fairness, justice, and equity, but the way things used to be. And so anti-Semitism is the undergird of all of that, and really all of the isms, racism, homophobia, all of the above orbit around that. And so it's really important to understand that the roots of this hatred is anti-Semitism, and anyone who is being brought into helping to move into this kind of idea of this new democracy that's for everyone is a threat.
Eileen, can I just say one more thing quickly, because you just made me think of something. We are also talking about a time where polarization is an all-time high, concerns for democracy, and it's coming at a time where our data shows that anti-Semitic incidents are at an all-time high. Not just collecting from ADL, but FBI hate crime data, right? So if the more sort of democracy is at risk, and you actually have data that shows anti-Semitism is increasing, that is sort of all you need to know about the connection between the two, right? We can look at the data that confirms everything that we've been saying up here.
Thank you. And one of the things I just want to underscore in that exchange is this wasn't some bluntly oversimplified thing about which ism, which bigotry is the worst threat. If you heard that, you misheard. What this is to go deep based on empirical data with the three people on both qualitative and quantitative data. The three people to my left here study to see how does anti-Semitism relate and corrode and erode democracy? How does it generate foundation, graph onto, mort, iterate on conspiracy theories? How does it interact with these other hates and bigotries? Because while there are similarities, there are also differences. And if we're going to be successful in the fight, we're going to have to understand that. Thanks also to your work. Bob, I'm going to go back to you. You and your team have deeply studied the 900 plus insurrectionists who've been charged by the Department of Justice coming out of January 6th. What have you learned about them?
We've learned a tremendous amount, person by person by person. What it adds up to is a disturbing picture of essentially well-off, normal, pro-Trump activists, not simply militia groups. Only 14% of those who have been charged, of the 900, only 14% are members of the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, or what the FBI and what others call violent extremist groups. Only 14%. The 90% roughly, who other 90% are not, they're the ones who overwhelmed the Capitol Hill police. If it had only been the 14%, we wouldn't have had January 6th. What made January 6th was not the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, it's the 90% who barreled through. Further, over half of the people who were charged are CEOs, business owners, white-collar occupations, doctors, lawyers, architects, accountants. They live in democratic strongholds. They live in San Francisco. They live in Dallas. They live in New York City, not upstate New York. So this is not rednecks, pickup trucks, rural area. That is certainly an issue. I don't mean to say that's not. That's a misreading of who the insurrectionists are. They are overwhelmingly in business suits, not in overalls. And so this is very important to see. And where do they come from? Where do they live? What's the number one statistic at the county level? That it's the loss of non-Hispanic white population. That's the key statistic. That also is true, not just of the insurrectionists who broke into the Capitol on January 6th, the Buffalo shooter. He's from Broome County, New York. He drove 3 hours to go to Buffalo. What's special about Broome County, New York? It is fully, technical term, one standard deviation to the end of losing white population. That means it's in the top 15% of the country losing white population. So he's on the front edges listening to all this talk about the Great Replacement, Tucker Carlson, Trump, the mini Trumps, and that is, you see it in his manifesto. So this is not just about January 6th, this is about the current threat that we face, and it's very important to understand that this is not simply the fringe elements, just a bunch of nut jobs, and that's it. There are nut jobs, okay, but that's true of any extremism.
You know, Bob, it reminds me, as they started making arrests after January 6th, I remember Orrin saying to me, this is different than violent extremist events we've seen and tracked because of who this population is, that they don't have known connections to this. They're not only younger white men. So that's a key thing. And then there's this status anxiety that is floating around, and a reason why the Great Replacement theory has such traction, and why, look at the counties, and really surprising what characterized the counties they came from. And I'm reminded also of the research that was done on Facebook by outside researchers and by Facebook itself, as we learned when the documents were leaked, that in the amplification of disinformation and violent conspiracies that led so directly to the genocide in Myanmar against the Rohingya, or when they looked at similar things in Mexico, India, and elsewhere, what they found is that there was a real logic to the type of information that got most amplified and was most inciting and inflammatory. And the logic was a majority frightened about a minority that they thought was taking over. Not the stuff that came on even among different tribes or communities that hated each other, but the stuff that got amplified, the stuff that Facebook said this is what's leading to problems, they picked 6 or 7 places, is status anxiety. When a majority, Buddhists and Muslims, Hindus and Muslims, looked at a group that it thought was going to replace their dominance or their majority. I'm going to turn now to Yolanda, though, about that persistent dissemination of misinformation and disinformation. Yolanda, can you talk about the role of mis and disinformation in the assault on democracy and explain its impact on marginalized communities?
Great opening, Eileen, for that, because I think that misinformation and disinformation is something that marginalized communities have access to all the time. The disinformation piece, I think, is very powerful because I think that this is intentionally put into marginalized communities to give this sort of psychological violence, so to speak, that really allows people to go down a deep rabbit hole with things that just aren't true. I want to use one example that's a little bit different from political violence and talk a little bit about the disinformation and misinformation around COVID and vaccines as an example of how this was intentionally put in markets where people from marginalized communities could access it. So when we think about really diving into how this disinformation and misinformation is disseminated to marginalized communities, although it seems like it's not something that's connected to the political violence, but it eventually leads there because people are misled, they're either disempowered or disenfranchised, and they don't feel as if they have a voice and they have a place in this society. And that's a part of the cycle, I think, that people have when they are thinking about what the world looks like today and what it used to look like. How do we do everything that we can to make sure that those marginalized communities, those black and brown folks, don't come out and vote, don't come out and feel like they're part of society in an equitable way? And it's part of the process that I think we're dealing with today.
Thank you. Going back again to Bob and then moving on. You have a sort of political, I'm probably going to misname it, but a political violence escalation trajectory that has 4 stages. You know, as we listen to people saying, we're going to see a lot more political violence, and some people saying, are we going to see something that approaches some version of civil war? Bob, where are we on this trajectory?
So civil war is the last stage, the 4th stage. I don't think we're on the verge of civil war. What I think we've been on the verge of and actually already experiencing is terrorism and political terrorism. And what I was specifically concerned about in September when I was on Face the Nation and I was in other places in Washington was political assassinations. And unfortunately, we've seen that effectively with the Pelosi attack. A lot of people thought that the violence, and this was true in 2020, that political violence happens on Election Day. Well, that's the old style. That's the old book of political violence. And there may have been some fights or something and so forth, but we don't even know about that. The real thing to tell you is the voting stopped. The counting has started, but the political violence season was already underway with the Pelosi attack, and we have to be concerned about this all the way through January 3rd. I actually said this 4 years, or in 2020, on October 5th, 2020, I said we have to be worried about political violence on January 6th. I'd said this in the media, nobody cared, because everybody thought it was on Election Day. Well, unfortunately, what we have to be concerned about is terrorism. That's lone wolf actor, typically, or small cells. We also have to be concerned that if there in fact are political protests that emerge, say with Kerry Lake or in Georgia and so forth, that those could in fact escalate into violence. Also Trump's prosecution. We asked questions in our survey in September about that. Even more millions are angry enough to support violence if Trump is prosecuted. That's just in the next few months. So we're going through, unfortunately, a precarious moment. There's no way for me to put a probability on this. You can't do that. What you can do is see the flashpoints coming, and we should be prepared.
Eileen, I want to just make a quick comment, because he said something really important. He doesn't think civil war is coming up anytime soon, and I didn't hear any applause for that, by the way. Like, that was good news. But now that I brought you up, let me bring you down. So that, I think that makes a lot of sense. Just looking at the sort of online space and how not just sort of fringe platforms, but the platforms that most people use. I gotta tell you, I don't know what civil war online looks like, but I kind of feel like we have a civil war happening online. Anybody who spends enough time there sees that, the way that sort of everyone takes a side and just piles on and then, engages in harassment and doxing, it gets worse and worse and then animates real world activity. And the thing about having a civil war online, and I don't know where this sort of fits into the rubric, but we know what happens online eventually happens in the real world. So I am not predicting a civil war, right? I'm just saying that I think the way that folks are communicating in online spaces regularly is training them how to communicate in the real world. And all too often we have seen the consequences of what happens in online spaces. So just wanted to add that.
And maybe, Warren, if this is okay, just to add a little bit back and forth on this. So what I tell law enforcement, what I tell folks in government, I'll share with you about the issue of civil war and how you'll know it's a serious issue. It's when there are a part of law enforcement or a part of our military that will break away. That is why Michael Flynn and what Flynn was doing as a former 3-star general, working with people who were his personal staff, that is in the military, mattered so much. So I study civil war around the world, okay? So when you look, not quite every civil war, but about 3/4 of all civil wars really start not just based on a bunch of protests, but it's when you have a breakaway faction of law enforcement or the military. And that would be a really scary moment because you're not putting that back together. So that's not a, oh my God, let's wait and react if that happens moment. So that's a little scary. I'm sorry to be,
Well,
I don't mean to scare everybody here, Warren.
No,
but-
no,
yeah.
forgive me. I am not arguing for civil war. I want to make sure everybody is sort of aware of that. But we did just put out a report that looked at an Oath Keeper leak of 38,000 people and found hundreds of people in law enforcement and military and our elected officials who are members of the Oath
And
Keepers.
this is why the work you're doing, Warren, so again, this is not to disagree, it's to sort of amplify. This is much more important than you may understand, because it's not a good idea to scare the public in this way, but I'm just sharing this with you, that is extremely concerning, because if that group breaks away, again, you need to prevent this, not wait and react afterwards.
So Bob, and I know we need to move on, where are we? Because if we're not at level 4, I think that there are people who think that they're in a civil war in a sense. I mean, that they're at war, that
So
there's
where
enough
we
at
are,
stake.
Yolanda, is that we have about 15 to 20 million in the population who are providing popular support for violence. That is creating a mantle of legitimacy for those lone wolf actors, the Buffalo shooter, the man who wanted retaliation for the FBI raid at Mar-a-Lago, who attacked in Cincinnati, and now the Pelosi attacker. In the last 6 months, we have effectively seen a campaign of political terrorism, all organized, all supported by essentially the insurrectionist movement. Now, it's not being directed in a way that ISIS would do it. It's not what command directed. It's what we call inspired attacks. These are the terms that we use with international terrorism, but they apply directly in our country as well. And that's why it matters so much that after the Pelosi attack, Carrie Lake, Donald Trump are laughing about this, literally laughing about this, and Tucker Carlson is literally laughing about this on television. This is the wink and the nod that this is certainly fine, let's have some more of it. And so this is, we need to see, we have already had a trajectory. It's a trajectory of inspired attacks of terrorism. And unfortunately, there's no reason to think that this is going to stop unless, and I'll say more at the end about what I think we should do, but this is the problem that we face, and it's here now, and it's not just going to stop because we had a good day on Tuesday.
So we're going to go a little bit longer, about 5-7 minutes longer than, we're going to stop at 12:05, but I'm going to take it on for 5 or 7 minutes longer than that. I want to get to some questions, but I first, very briefly, in a minute or less, for each of you, what can be done? What strategies will work?
So I'd like to just start by asking you to remember 3 words. Yes, we can. Right now, there is tremendous pessimism. You can't change people's minds. You can't do this. You can't do that. If nothing else, see Tuesday as an opportunity to think we could build a bipartisan coalition against political violence. Now, that doesn't mean everybody's going to vote Democrat. That doesn't mean you're going to change that. What it means is you can build a coalition with vast majorities of Democrats, independents, and even Republicans against political violence. The ADL of all the organizations could play a huge role in making that happen for the country. Yes, we can.
So it's kind of interesting. I'm going to out you, and you might get really mad at me, Bob, but you described, in one of our lead-up conversations, you described yourself as a Republican without a home, so it's fun to hear
That's right.
a Republican without a home
Chuck Hagel, Republican.
quoting the campaign slogan of Barack Obama. Yolanda or Orrin, who wants to... Chicago, University of Chicago. Who wants to say something next? Yolanda.
I'll jump in and just say what an amazing time to be alive right now, to be a part of history. And we really are a part of history right now. And so what can we do? Education, engagement, awareness. And I often use this terminology around ancestors and descendants. So if we think about what our ancestors did for us, that's why we are here. That's why we are able to do what we can do today. So ask yourself the question, what kind of ancestor do you want to be? What kind of legacy do you want to leave for descendants and generations to come? And the time is now. The urgency of now is upon us. And so we have to make sure we're in conversation and dialogue with not just the people who think like us, but people who don't think like us, because we want to make sure we're bringing people along. And then the second piece is understanding and being very clear about who you are and what you stand up for. And so we look back at the last 48 hours, and I don't know how elections turned out for folks and what you think about that, but people were out there, they were engaged, they felt empowered, and so we want to continue to do that and to make sure that we're bringing others along with us. That's our call to action.
I'll be super quick. Two things that I think people could do. One is if you find a local expert investigator, people who are spending a lot of time in these spaces trying to figure it out, buy them a drink. That's one. Number two is I actually think we need to start thinking about how do we provide the information, the education to people in a way that they actually really want to hear it. Not everybody wants to hear a panel speak. Not everybody wants to go on a website and read it. Maybe people want to see it in sort of some sort of TikTok dance form. I don't know what it is, but you know what? I would love to do that. I would love to explore those conversations about how do we get positive messages and different ways of revealing information so that people are at least equipped to make the right decision, but let's give it to them in a way that they want to take in that information and not rely on 1980s.com.
So a couple questions. There are several questions I got here. I'm going to push them together. They are about anti-Semitism and illiberalism on the left and where that fits in. So the questions are, okay, this panel has just talked about what might be the most exigent and violent immediate threat, but we just got out of a plenary where folks were talking a lot about anti-Semitism on the left. Is that just a distraction for the bigger fight, do you all think? Or is that something that is also corrosive of democracy? Is that a threat, and how do you assess it? Who wants to start on that? We started with Bob before first, so let's go either Oren or Yolanda.
All right. I mean, anti-Semitism is a threat to democracy, period. I don't care where it comes from, but I think the solution to the effects of anti-Semitism on democracy, I think, should come from people who may be able to reach the folks who are they're closest to. So if you're seeing anti-Semitism on the right and you identify yourself as a little more right, talk to the people on the right and say, that's not acceptable, tell them why. They're more willing to hear that coming from somebody that they probably agree on many things with. Same on the left. If you see anti-Semitism on the left, you consider yourself lefty, progressive, whatever we want to use, it is up to you to make sure that you're saying why this is damaging, why this is problematic, why it's undermining democracy. But instead of pointing to the other side all the time, we ought to point to our own folks that we will resonate with more, and that's where we'll be more effective, and that's where we'll be better at saving democracy.
And I'll add, even if it's unconscious and people don't understand that they are repeating stereotypes or tropes, regardless of where it's coming from, and like Oren said, if you're closer to a specific community, then it's your responsibility to call the person in. We don't have to call people out unless we have to, but we want to call people in and we want to make them aware of what they're thinking and what they're saying and how that contributes to anti-Semitism more globally. And I think that's all of our responsibilities.
So I'd like to just add to this. I agree with everything that's been said by pointing out a further step between where we are now and civil war, which is a spiral. Because you see, right now, most of the attacks are occurring by folks on the right. We did have the plot against Brett Kavanaugh. But unfortunately, the history of civil war, the precursors to civil war tell us that as you have more and more violence by one side, others start to get afraid, they start to get armed, they start to mobilize, and some of them start to think they should act defensively and so forth. Now, what does that mean for anti-Semitism? Unfortunately, the Jewish community can get it from both sides. The Jewish community can get it from both sides. So of all the folks here, and you heard this morning with Jonathan, but of all the folks here in the whole country who should be the most concerned about the spiral of violence that I'm just describing, you don't have to wait for the Civil War. If that spiral, again, if this continues, unfortunately, the prediction would be we should expect spirals of violence. And that means the Jewish community is going to be in the middle on enemies, viewed as enemies of all sides. This is not a good situation. This is why I said the ADL is the most important organization in the whole country right now. It is bipartisan. There's a bipartisan solution, and the Jewish community has the most at stake.
Bob is not on our payroll, but actually. So I do want to make that, we cannot do this unless we are in solidarity with other groups. Remember, we are 2%, the Jews at least, and the ADL actually is kind of pretty much split our staff. This is really interesting, between Jews and non-Jews, by the way. It's like 53% Jewish in our last thing. We can't do this alone. We're 2% and sinking of this country and 0.02% of the world. Small amount of people to be exercising so much cabal-type power, it seems. Anyhow, we only have 3 minutes, is it? 3 minutes, I'm being told, and I have a couple of announcements at the end, so I'm just going to ask one of you to take this last question. There are 3 or 4 questions about social media has, which was heralded as a great democratizer, has really, net seemed to be far more destructive. Can social media be used effectively to fight the very destructive things that it's spreading? Question on social media? Warren?
Sure. The question was what? Oh, yeah. Can social media be used as a way to help protect our democracy? I think the answer is yes, right? The technology itself is agnostic, right? It's amazing. We spend so much time talking about how painful Twitter and Facebook and all these platforms are. The technology is amazing. It's how people use that. And frankly, bad actors and people who want to divide are using it really, really effectively. But that is also an opportunity for us to create messaging using those tools to try to spread hope and inspiration and remind people that as terrible as things may seem in this moment in time, that there's a role for everybody to play to make sure that when history judges us, there's a lot of positivity in how people responded that will ultimately resonate. I think that is about messaging, I think that's about branding, and it's something that me, as a 40-something-year-old, will not be doing. But I work with a whole bunch of younger people, there's a whole bunch of content creators out there that we need to tap into their expertise because they know how to make something compelling. And by the way, freedom, hope, democracy is really compelling if you give people a chance to make it that. So yes, the answer is 100% yes.
Thank you so much, Yolanda and Oren and Bob. And just a couple quick housekeeping announcements. Take action now. There are different action centers where you can go and you can text messages for some of the policy proposals that will, to federal and state legislatures. You can text REPAIR to 72572, REPAIR to 72572 to tell lawmakers to hold big tech accountable for protecting consumers from online hate. Keep fighting. Go to our website and look at and sign the PROTECT plan to combat domestic terrorism. So, next panels, starting very shortly, you can go to Preparing Your Community for Anti-Semitic Threats, Anti-Zionism's Global Reach, the high school student workshop, or you can have lunch. Thank you all.